Welcome everybody. Thanks for making your way on this really quite beautiful winter day. We all should be having this outside actually. Really, it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Alan Renwick from the Constitutional Unit at the University College London, where he's the Deputy Director. Alan is on a research tour.
Sounds great.
That's right, exactly. And really tackling a host of issues that are quite prominent in this age of fake news and declining public confidence in political parties, including their ability to actually speak the truth or hold on to the truth and promises. And looking at this really quite important topic, which is the name of the seminar, as to the ways in which, including legal regulatory measures that could be directed at actually improving the quality of discourse at elections and referendums. And I think Alan's project that this research tour involves is a comparative study. I think there's at least 6 countries, I think you mentioned,
something like that.
Australia, New Zealand, Netherlands, Germany,
Ireland,
a
bit of UK,
and a bit of UK. More than half a dozen countries. So I think he's particularly interested in whatever comparative observations that you might have. So without any further ado, Dr. Renwick.
Thank you, Ju Chong, for inviting me to speak today, and thank you to all of you for being here. As Ju Chong has said, I'm here in order to conduct the research for this project, so I'm at the stage of having questions and some kind of hunches as to possible answers, but not yet having answers. So my purpose in coming here and speaking with you today is really to hear from you as much as to talk to you about what I'm doing. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this project at the end. So you can see the question that this project is asking, and the idea for this project has been brewing for several years, but it very much crystallized last year as a result of some things that happened in the UK political world that you might have noticed. We had our referendum, of course, on Brexit. So I thought it would be useful for me to start off with just a few images of that campaign, partly to give you a sense of my starting point in this project, but partly also because it illustrates the variety of problems that have been encountered in campaigning recently. So this is perhaps the most famous image the most famous slogan of that particular referendum campaign. So the Vote Leave people said, "We send the EU £350 million a week." Now this was simply false. We do not send the EU £350 million a week. The UK, in principle, sends £350 million a week to the EU, but there's a rebate that was negotiated by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, so we don't actually send the full amount of money to the EU. So that was simply an out-and-out false statement that was at the core of one of the campaigns last year. Then it also says there, let's fund our NHS instead. Now that is not a factual statement at all, it's a statement of policy, it's a statement of intent, but it's intended to convey the idea that this money, if we weren't in the EU, we would have all of it there in order to spend on the NHS. And even if they had the correct figure for the amount that we actually send to the EU, then that would still be rather misleading, because a lot of that money comes back and is spent in the UK for a variety of purposes. So that second line there has misleading implications going beyond what is in the first line. Another celebrated bit of the campaign was this. So this is one of the leaflets that went round from the Vote Leave campaign. So it says there, countries set to join the EU, and then there's a map, and the only countries named on the map are Syria and Iraq. These are not set to join the EU. Furthermore, so we wonder what's going on there. Furthermore, the countries that are being claimed, if you look at it closely, as being set to join the EU are the ones in red, clearly. These are countries that are negotiating to join the EU. The EU has accepted them as candidates for joining the EU. But it seems to me that the phrase set to join the EU means that they're kind of on a track to join, and unless something goes wrong, they're actually going to join. That's how I would interpret those words, whereas that is not the case. Particularly with Turkey, it's been negotiating for 30 years and the negotiations have made no progress at all. So to say that it's set to join the EU, well, it's a matter of interpretation of what you mean by the words, but it seems fairly misleading, again, to me. This is the front of the same leaflet. Now this is interesting for various reasons. Here it says 5 new countries are in the queue to join the EU. Now that's correct. They are in the queue. They're not moving, but they're in the queue. Then it says you have to decide whether this will help Britain, Europe, and fair access to public services. Well, that's curious. And what's this in that statement? Is it that there are 5 countries in the queue to join the EU? Well, no. Presumably they mean this is that they actually joined the EU. So we're already getting a bit of a shift there into misleading territory. And you have to decide whether this will help. Do you have to decide that? Is that relevant, given that they're not actually going to join the EU? Is it relevant that you would have to consider whether that's a good idea or not? So there's some confusion going on there. Here we have Britain's official bill for EU membership is £19 billion per year. So the official bill, yes, the official bill is that, in a sense, and then there's a rebate. Again, you have to decide whether what we get back from the EU is worth this. Well, again, that implies that we actually send that money, which we don't. So some shady territory there too. And then a further thing is the very top line of that leaflet, which is rather interesting. It says, official information about the referendum on 23rd June 2016. Well, it's not official information. It's information from one of the campaign organisations. So this is a leaflet that is sent out at public expense, so that the taxpayer pays for the postage of this leaflet. And that's sometimes referred to informally as the official communication. So you can see, okay, well, official communication, official information, but it's not official information. That's a clearly, again, incorrect claim that is being made. Problems weren't just on that side of the referendum. So this is George Osborne, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, claiming during the campaign that it would cost Brexit would cost UK families £4,300 a year. There were lots of things problematic about this claim. One thing is that this is clearly no more than a projection based on economic modelling. There's no indication here that there's uncertainty associated with this claim. In addition, all they did is take the estimate of what total GDP would be in, I think it was 2030, and divide it by the number of households in order to get this figure. So it looks like this is the figure for the change in household incomes, but actually the change in household incomes would be much smaller than that because not all of GDP flows through households. And there were various other more particular problems with this figure. This is another document that came from the Treasury, so an official government document shortly before the referendum, saying that a vote to leave would be a shock that would push our economy into a recession and lead to an increase in unemployment of around 500,000, etc. Again, there's no indication of uncertainty around these projections as to what the immediate effects of a Brexit vote would be. And as we now know, the economy has not gone into recession. Unemployment has not risen. In fact, it's continued to fall. Some of these things have happened. Inflation is indeed higher. Sterling is weaker. Real wages are lower, and that can directly be linked to Brexit. But some of the things have not happened. And there's no recognition in this statement of the uncertainty around such projections. So all of these things led to various concerns in many circles. This was a statement that came from a House of Commons committee during the campaign. The public debate is being poorly served by inconsistent, unqualified, and in some cases misleading claims and counterclaims coming from both sides of the campaign. This was a more graphic way of putting roughly the same point in a demonstration that happened just after the referendum. We can also look at polling evidence on what the public thought. So this was conducted by the UK Electoral Commission. Proportions of people agreeing or disagreeing with the statement that the conduct of the referendum was fair and balanced. So 52% disagreed, only 34% agreed, and similarly a disfavourable response on the claim that the referendum was not covered in a fair and balanced way in media and broadcasting. So most people agreed that it was not covered in a fair and balanced way. We can also look at the effects of all of this, or we can try to look at the effects of all of this through public opinion polling of knowledge. So on that claim that it costs £350 million a week to be in the EU, 78% of voters had heard of this claim, and 54% believed it to be true. Only 39% believed it to be false, according to this survey, which was conducted about 10 days before the referendum. Here are some of the statements that were being made about what would happen if the UK voted to remain in the EU. Britain would be made to pay billions of pounds in bailouts for Eurozone countries in the future. So this is a straight false statement. The UK is not liable for payments to Eurozone countries for bailouts, but more people thought it true than thought it false. Turkey will be fast-tracked into the European Union, and their population of 75 million people will have the right of free movement to the UK. This is total nonsense. And this goes beyond what was being claimed by any of the serious Leave supporters. So there's no prospect of Turkey being fast-tracked into the EU, but equal numbers said that they thought that was true or false. Higher risk of sex attacks on women by migrants, so most people thought that was false. It wasn't a claim that was being made in the campaign anyway. Then statements about what would happen if Britain voted to leave. Peace and stability on our continent will be put at risk. Most people thought that false. True or false? Very difficult to say. So I don't think we learned much from that one. The stability of Northern Ireland will be put at risk. Well, this is clearly correct. It is already the case that the government in Northern Ireland has collapsed, in part because of the vote for Brexit. And there are real issues around what will happen to the border in Northern Ireland and what impact that will have on the peace process. So certainly stability in Northern Ireland is put at risk, but a great majority of people thought that was false. UK households will lose £4,300 per year, so not many people bought that one, which might in part explain the result of the referendum, of course. So quite a few false claims are being agreed with by large numbers of people here. Now, you have to be careful with survey evidence like this. It may be that people are not reporting their actual beliefs as such, but rather they're kind of expressing their tribal loyalty with one or other side by agreeing or disagreeing with statements. But nevertheless, I think there's probably some valid and useful evidence in this material. So, lots of concerns in the UK about this referendum campaign, and those concerns are seen on both sides. So it's not just the losers of the referendum who are unhappy. Many of those on the winning side also have expressed concerns. Leading to this research question. And as I said, the question doesn't just come from this referendum. So it relates to referendums and also to elections. So clearly there have also been concerns about developments in the United States around the election last year, and elections in other places as well. So the phenomena that we're looking at here are general phenomena about problems with elections and referendums in democracies these days. Now, as you'll be aware, there's quite a lot of interesting thought taking place at the moment on these issues and possible responses to them. So in particular, there's a lot of attention being given to fake news and so-called fake news and efforts to combat fake news, particularly efforts by the tech giants, Facebook, Twitter, Google, and so on, to try to prevent or slow the spread of fake news. Also a lot of talk about civics education. So in the UK there were 3 books published within a week of each other in May, all with the title Post-Truth, all looking at this phenomenon, so-called phenomenon, of post-truth politics and how to deal with it. And all of them focused in these areas on what the tech giants can do. I'm sorry, I have a New Zealand cold, so sorry that I'm spluttering at you. So what the tech giants can do and what civics education can do. My project is perhaps a bit more narrowly focused, but fortuitously focused on the sorts of thing that the Electoral Regulation Research Network focuses on, and thinking about how public policy changes in relation to how elections and referendums are conducted could make a difference to these things. And I'm focused here partly because I'm an expert on election law, election systems, and referendum processes. But partly also because I think if we just focus on kind of what the tech giants can do, that kind of thing, then we're slightly losing confidence in the democratic process. Clearly there's no possibility for democratic control as such over what the tech giants do. So if we want collectively democratically to be thinking about what measures can be taken in order to address these issues, then we shouldn't be shy of thinking about, well, what can public policy do in this area? A lot of the commentators in this area say, well, we don't want the state getting involved in deciding what's true and all that kind of thing. We don't want the state doing this. We want us to be doing it. But we are the state in a democracy, if the democracy is functioning effectively. So I think it is important that we think about public policy responses to these issues, not just rely on Facebook and so on to do stuff. So the project that I'm doing, and the reason I've been in New Zealand last week and Australia this week, is that I'm looking at, well, what happens in democracies around the world. What mechanisms have been tried for intervening during campaigns, and do these things work, or can we learn lessons from them that would be useful for other places? And I think there are basically three approaches to tackling this that within the electoral arena that have been taken. So the first is perhaps the crudest and says that, okay, if there's a problem with people lying, then the solution is stop them from lying. So I call this the anti-misinformation approach, that you simply stop actors from making false or misleading claims. Second approach is perhaps a bit more subtle and says, okay, well, just directly stopping them may be a bit problematic. What we rather want to do is crowd out the bad information by providing lots of good quality information. So by providing accurate, authoritative information during election and referendum campaigns, which I'll call the pro-information approach. And then the third approach says that, well, it's not enough just to be providing information for people. What matters is not what information is provided, but how people actually engage in, think about, talk about electoral and referendum choices. And we need to be thinking about the capacity of voters to and citizens to deliberate effectively and consider the information that is available to them. So I'll call that the pro-deliberation approach. And I'll say a few things now about each of these approaches. So what forms they take, where they're used, what questions seem to arise in relation to each of them, and then I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts. So, first of all, the anti-misinformation approach. So, this approach has had some prominent advocates in the UK, particularly since the referendum last year. This was an early day motion, which is just a way in which MPs can kind of express a view on something, that was lodged last summer, shortly after the referendum, and signed by about 50 MPs. And this motion supported the call for the establishment of an independent Office of Electoral Integrity to factually verify the truthfulness of claims made during political campaigns, with power to issue clarifications and fines where appropriate. So a proposal for a really direct intervention to say what's true, what's false, and to punish people who fall on the wrong side of that. Now, there are in reality various different ways in which you can pursue an anti-misinformation approach, and these vary. I've put them on two dimensions here, varying according to the scope of the dimension, so low where they're quite narrowly focused on a small range of communication, up to high scope where they're much broader, and the severity of intervention varying depending on what the punishment is if you are found to have engaged in false information. So at one end of the spectrum here we have a provision in New Zealand which I was investigating last week. So the New Zealand Electoral Act, section 199A, makes it a criminal offence, a corrupt act in electoral law terms, to knowingly make a false statement during the last 2 days of an election campaign. So it's very narrow in that it's only the last 2 days of an election campaign. The statement has to be knowingly false, and it has to be made with the intention of influencing how someone votes. But it's a criminal act, so potentially you could go to jail if you are found guilty of this. So that is at one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, we have provisions such as, in New Zealand again, the Advertising Standards Authority has power to issue rulings with respect to political advertising. So if it finds that a political advertisement is false or misleading, it can request that the advertisers stop using that advertisement. So that has very broad scope. It applies to all political advertising as to all other advertising, but low severity of intervention in the sense that there's just a request to stop using the advertisement, and there's no formal power actually to enforce that. Then somewhere between these is provision in South Australia, so I'm off to Adelaide tomorrow in order to investigate this, where Section 113 of the Electoral Act says that you cannot have an advertisement that makes a factual claim that is false or misleading. And that applies throughout an election campaign. But the severity of the intervention is typically lower than in the New Zealand case. Typically what happens is that the Electoral Commission requests that someone stop using an advertisement, and generally they comply with that request. There is the possibility of taking court action ultimately, but I'm not sure if that's ever happened. I'm looking at Jenny, no. The normal practice is simply there's a request to take down the information. So, various things to consider about this. First of all, I think it's fairly clear that there's a trade-off between, on the one hand, preventing misinformation and, on the other hand, protecting free speech. So you could say, well, you don't need to protect blatantly false speech. So you can ban very clearly false statements. But as the illustrations at the start, I hope, showed, very few of the misleading statements are very, very clearly false. And you can generally restate a misleading statement that is false in terms that are not strictly speaking false, but still misleading. So just banning very, very clearly false statements isn't necessarily going to get you terribly far in terms of preventing misinformation. But if you try to push further in order to capture more of the statements that are misleading but not strictly speaking false, then you get into bigger dangers of violating free speech, having a chilling effect upon political discussion. So we need to be aware of that trade-off. So while I was in New Zealand last week, I was looking at does the New Zealand provision work? Does it manage to successfully balance this trade-off? And the answer was pretty clearly no, it doesn't work, it has no effect whatsoever. It's very, very narrowly drawn, and in fact has never been applied. And so far as I could tell, no politician's even aware that it exists. So it doesn't even have an effect on behaviour as people try to avoid coming under its provision. What about the higher scope, lower penalty provisions, such as the work of an Advertising Standards Authority, or such as the South Australian provision? Does it have any? Do these things have any impact on what campaigners say? Are they neutral? Are they perceived as being neutral? Well, I'll be in Adelaide, as I said, to find out about the South Australian provision. With regard to the New Zealand provision, the work of the Advertising Standards Authority, this does have an impact. There are cases brought. Parties are aware of it. Parties do seek advisory opinions before they put up advertisements in order to see whether they are likely to run into problems or not. And the Kiwis certainly all said to me, the £350 million bus thing, that would just have been stopped in New Zealand very, very quickly. But does it make a broader difference to the tenor of debate, or do parties just kind of manage to find ways of getting around it? I suspect probably the latter. So that raises the question of, is this approach useful at all? And I'm pretty sceptical, to be honest. Perhaps there are some marginal uses. Perhaps you can prevent people from claiming they're giving official information when they're not, that kind of thing. But whether you can really try to regulate the content of claims in this way is dubious, in my view. Which moves us on to the pro-information approach. And again, here there are various different approaches that can be taken. I've attempted two dimensions here again. I'm less sure that these are useful, but from more passive to more active, and from more reactive to more proactive. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Firstly, there's fact-checking, which of course is happening in many places these days. I've put on cases where there's official public policy support for fact-checking. So in New Zealand, the Electoral Commission funded Vote Compass at the last election, and it's funding two fact-checkers. Vote Compass is not fact-checking. I get on to Vote Compass later. In New Zealand and Irish referendums, the Electoral Commission or the Referendum Commission in Ireland basically performs a fact-checking function itself. So that's reactive in the sense that it's simply reacting to claims that are being made during the campaign and giving a response to them. Moving towards more proactive in the sense of not just relying on claims that are being made, but giving kind of fresh information. The Netherlands is a very interesting case in which there are a variety of policy audits. So there's costing of manifesto pledges is done by the Central Planning Bureau, which is responsible for costing of budgets in the Netherlands. And there are also audits of, as it says there, the environmental impact of manifesto pledges and various other matters as well. I understand that in Australia there's something similar with the Parliamentary Budget Office. I don't know very much about that yet, so anyone who wants to talk about that, I would be interested. And then more proactive still, so then you're still to some extent responding to the policies that the parties are putting out. More proactive still, particularly in referendum campaigns, there are to varying degrees in many different systems public information campaigns explaining the options and setting out the choice that is available to voters. So as I understand it, in Australia, for the most part the information is statements provided by the campaigners on both sides, which might or might not contain useful information. In some other places there is neutral information on both sides, and again New Zealand goes further than anywhere else in this regard, at least with some of their referendums, in providing detailed explanations of the options, in setting out what are the criteria that might be used in order to choose between these options, in considering how the options can be weighed up relative to each of these criteria. So in New Zealand, the Electoral Commission, again, has been quite bold in providing quite a lot of information, not just saying what the systems are, but also trying to help people understand how they can choose between the systems. All of those are passive from the voter's point of view, in the sense that they're just providing information to voters without voters being able to say anything in return. More active from the point of view of voters are what we call voter advice applications. So this is where we get into something like Vote Compass. So these websites where you can answer lots of questions about your policy preferences, say something about the weight you attach, how important different policies are to you, and the website will then tell you which parties are closer to you in policy terms. And again, these are happening in many, many places. I've put up some cases where, again, there's public policy backing for these applications. So in Germany, the Federal Ministry of Education runs one of these things itself. In New Zealand, Vote Compass was funded in part by the Electoral Commission at the last election, and as I mistakenly said earlier, is doing so again at this election. So there's a variety of forms of information that can be provided during election campaigns. Again, there are some questions that need to be asked. So can an official information campaign such as this be unbiased? Clearly, you need it to be provided by a genuinely independent body. That body needs to be drawing on expertise. Still, it is often, people in the UK often say to me, yeah, but look at a referendum. I mean, most of the issues that are being decided are highly contested, highly political. You can't really claim that you can put out unbiased information in that context. And clearly it is true that a lot of the issues are contested and a lot are matters of value judgment, but it does seem to me at least that there are still some matters of fact that can be put out there. And when there's contestation, then a public information campaign can say, these areas are contested. These are areas where there's some doubt. Most experts argue this, but some argue this kind of thing. So a public information campaign that is open and honest about uncertainty seems to me to be helpful potentially for voters in understanding the nature of the choice before them. We need to consider also whether there's a trade-off between neutrality and impact here. So particularly public bodies such as electoral commissions are, for very obvious reasons, concerned to be absolutely neutral and not to risk being perceived as biased in any way. And there can be a tendency as a result to focus only on really strictly correct things and not trying to extend beyond that. So the Referendum Commissions in Ireland, for example, which are responsible for providing public information on referendums, tend simply to describe the change in the law that is being proposed without going into the details of what are the implications of those changes in the law, because the implications are politically contestable and they're worried that they could damage their reputation for independence if they get into these issues. But the implications are what actually matter for voters often. And if you want the public information campaign to have an impact on how the issues are perceived, then you need to get into that territory. Otherwise, you're not going to influence the discourse. Similarly, with the tone of content, there can be a tendency for information to be presented in a very dry manner, but if you want to influence people, then perhaps you need to be a little bit bolder in how you speak. And so I talked about whether a campaign can, in principle, be unbiased. Clearly, there's also a question of whether it's going to be seen as unbiased. And here, I think, as it says there, the media environment, the nature of the issue, the degree to which there's existing polarization around the issue, the degree to which politicians are involved in the debate are really important for shaping the degree to which it's going to be possible to present a campaign that will be seen as unbiased. In New Zealand, with their electoral reform referendum in 2011, it was a technical issue, politicians weren't terribly much involved, there was low polarization, low salience of the issue really for the public. So it wasn't very difficult to put forward a campaign that was seen as being perfectly fair. If I try to imagine doing such a campaign on Brexit, where it's highly polarised, where we have newspapers that see themselves as being campaign sheets rather than as media in the strict sense, that are perfectly willing to mislead and lie in order to put their line across, then it's far harder to see that this campaign, a public information campaign, can be effective and can avoid being undermined by those who find it useful to undermine it for their own purposes. So skepticism about expertise and willingness of certain political actors in a polarised environment to whip up skepticism about expertise, I think, is a real problem with this kind of public information campaign, certainly in the UK context, probably in other contexts as well. Which leads me on, finally, to the third approach to this kind of thing, which really says that rather than just relying on expert judgment in order to provide quality information during campaigns. Perhaps rather we should be trying to encourage citizens themselves to engage in deliberation and think deeply about the issues. And so far as I'm aware, the only attempt really to do this in practice is in Oregon, where with regard to referendums, so citizen-initiated ballot propositions, in some cases, not in all, they do a process which is called the Citizen Initiative Review, where they do essentially a citizens' jury on the issue that is being put to voters in the referendum. So they get together 24 citizens randomly selected from across the state. They bring them together for 5 days. They give them lots of information, allow them to hear from experts and campaigners and all sorts of different people. They give them time to deliberate. And then these people can come up with a statement, or two statements, one on each side, setting out how they see the issue, what they see the main arguments as, what they see as being the credible claims and the not so credible claims. And then that information is sent out to all voters in the voter information pack that goes round before the vote. And that, at least in principle, seems to me to be a really good way of not just relying on experts and kind of getting around the issue of skepticism about experts by allowing voters to see what a group of regular Oregon people think once they've had the time really to consider the matter in depth. So this is what one of these statements looks like. This is a page from the voter information pack. You can see that they have not done a lot of very deep thinking in how to make this accessible to the regular voter. So it's really dry, black and white, small text, all this kind of thing. And if you look very closely at the top of that slide, you can see that this is page 122 of the voter information pack. So whether many voters are actually managing to notice this is a bit of a moot point. There's some polling evidence that suggests that many do, but many do read it and many do find it useful. But I'm a little bit sceptical about how much weight we can place on this. So it seems to me that the Oregon model is a really interesting one for an interesting idea about how to get citizens more engaged in these processes, but it's only a starting point. Certainly it needs to be made much more user-friendly. And I think also it's important to think about other ways in which citizen deliberation, could be brought into these processes of trying to generate good quality information during campaigns. And I've just put a few others on there. So one idea is fact-checking by citizens' juries. So if there is skepticism about the fact-checkers, and there are people claiming that the fact-checkers are just members of the establishment who are out to destroy the ordinary good people and what they believe, maybe fact-checking by citizens' juries would be helpful for dealing with that. As I said, in New Zealand, the public information was provided during a referendum campaign that went before just describing the options and also set out what criteria might be used to judge between the options and how people might use those criteria. That seems to be a fantastic thing to do in principle, but it's really dangerous if people say, well, these criteria don't relate to what I care about here. And if it's just a bunch of political scientists or experts defining the criteria, then that again could undermine confidence in the information. But if you have citizens involved in working out, well, what are the things that they care about in this decision, then you might be able to strengthen this process. Often town hall meetings and other such gatherings are held during campaigns. I heard about this quite a lot in New Zealand. We've just had a little discussion before this seminar where some of you were mentioning some things that have happened here. Often these are conceived as opportunities for voters to receive information from experts again. If you can make them more deliberative, perhaps they have more effect. Deliberation Day, I won't go into detail now, but some of you will be aware that that's a kind of big proposal for doing that on a grand scale. And finally, there have been citizens' assemblies that have taken place in some places preceding referendums, where a selection of voters have worked over an extended period, multiple weekends over many months, up to a year, in order to work out what should happen in a particular policy area, develop a proposal. and that proposal has then gone to referendum. So this model has particularly been used in Canada, but it's never been used well. The information coming from the Citizens' Assembly has never been transferred adequately into the referendum campaign so that voters could see that information and understanding. So again, integrating citizens' assemblies into referendum processes could be a really useful way of doing things. So I think we're kind of at the beginning stages, really, of thinking about ways of encouraging deliberation as a way of improving information and discourse during election and referendum campaigns. Oregon has got us going, but I think it's only a starting point. I think there are many other things that could be tried and could be really, really useful. That's all I will say. That's definitely enough for me. That's the point that I have reached in this research so far, but as I said, I'm really interested in your ideas.